Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back to an era of sprawling empires, marble forums, and the surprising culinary preferences of some of history's most powerful figures. Imagine, if you will, the bustling streets of ancient Rome, the scent of exotic spices mingling with the dust, the clang of armor, and the murmur of 1,000 different conversations. You're walking among senators in their flowing togas, soldiers returning from distant campaigns, and merchants hawking their wares. The sheer vibrancy of it all, the noise, the sheer life. It's a world utterly removed from our own. A world where the very concept of a balanced meal might surprise you, and where an emperor, the absolute ruler of the known world, found solace and sustenance in a leafy green vegetable. You might think you know Roman emperors, their excesses, their ambitions, their opulent feasts. But tonight, we're peeling back a very specific, rather verdant layer of history to uncover something truly unique. You probably wouldn't survive a single week living on the diet we're about to explore, let alone governing an empire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel across the globe. Now, settle in, because our journey takes us to the reign of an emperor who, despite ruling one of the largest empires in history, is perhaps best remembered, at least in some circles, for his unusual dietary habits. We are talking, of course, about Diocletian. He was a man of immense power, a brilliant administrator, and a formidable military leader. Yet later in his life, he developed a profound, almost singular, attachment to lettuce. Yes, you heard that right, lettuce. Not the finest cuts of roasted boar, not exotic fruits brought from the far corners of the empire, not even the rich stews and breads that formed the staple diet of his subjects. Just lettuce, a simple, unassuming leafy green. It seems almost too mundane, doesn't it, for a man who held the fate of millions in his hands? But it's precisely this quiet, almost eccentric detail that makes him so fascinating for our purposes tonight. Diocletian's story isn't just about a peculiar diet, however. It's a story of an empire teetering on the brink of collapse, of a man who stepped up and almost single-handedly pulled it back from the precipice, and then, perhaps even more surprisingly, walked away from it all. He was an emperor who brought an unprecedented level of stability to Rome after decades of civil war and unrest, only to retire to a quiet life of gardening and, yes, growing and eating his beloved lettuce. Imagine the sheer audacity of it, to hold absolute power, to have the world at your feet, and then to voluntarily relinquish it all for the simple pleasures of the earth. It's a concept almost alien to our modern understanding of ambition and success. For nearly 50 years prior to Diocletian's ascension, the Roman Empire had been a revolving door of emperors, a bewildering succession of short reigns, assassinations, and civil strife known as the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a period of constant warfare, economic collapse, and widespread uncertainty. The very fabric of Roman society seemed to be unraveling. Provinces were breaking away, barbarian tribes were pressing at the borders, and the loyalty of the legions was constantly in doubt. It was a time when the average Roman citizen lived with a pervasive sense of insecurity, never knowing which general would seize power next, or what new tax burden would be imposed to fund the endless conflicts. Life was harsh, unpredictable, and often brutally short. The idea of anyone finding peace, let alone a peculiar culinary contentment, in such an environment seems almost unbelievable. So, how did a man born into relative obscurity in Dalmatia, a province on the eastern Adriatic coast, come to dominate this chaotic landscape and, eventually, embrace a life centered around vegetables? His early life was far from aristocratic, a stark contrast to many of the emperors who preceded him. He was a man who rose through the ranks, not through inherited wealth or family connections, but through sheer military prowess and administrative skill. He understood the legions, he understood the common soldier, and he understood the immense pressures of governing a sprawling, fractious empire. And it was this understanding, this pragmatic approach to power, that would define his reign and ultimately lead him down the path to his rather peculiar retirement. We'll delve into his humble beginnings next, exploring the foundational experiences that forged the man who would eventually come to be known for his love of lettuce and the extraordinary legacy he left behind. Diocletian, or more formally, Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, didn't start life with the golden spoon of Roman aristocracy. In fact, quite the opposite. He was born around 244 AD in Dalmatia, a region that's part of modern-day Croatia. His family was of humble origins, perhaps even former slaves, though details are scarce and often debated among historians. This humble background, however, wasn't a hindrance. In the turbulent 3rd century, it was almost a prerequisite for advancement in the military. Unlike the pampered scions of noble families, men who rose from the ranks often possessed a raw, practical intelligence, resilience, and a deep understanding of the realities of soldiering. Diocletian was one such man. Imagine the young Diocletian, not in a grand Roman villa, but on a more rugged coastline, perhaps helping his family with simple tasks, observing the harsh realities of provincial life. His early experiences would have instilled in him a pragmatism and a keen eye for efficiency, qualities that would later define his reign. He understood what it meant to work hard, to endure, and to make the most of limited resources. These weren't lessons learned in a philosophy school, but forged in the crucible of everyday life. His path to power was through the Roman army, the primary avenue for social mobility for ambitious men of his era, especially those without established connections. The Roman military was a brutal, demanding world, but it was also a meritocracy to a degree. If you were capable, if you were courageous, and if you could command respect, you could rise, and rise he did. Diocletian distinguished himself through a series of military campaigns, earning promotions steadily. He gained experience not just in leading troops in battle, but also in logistics, strategy, and administrational crucial skills for governing an empire. He served under several emperors during the chaotic crisis of the 3rd century, a period where emperors came and went with alarming frequency. Each new emperor meant a reshuffling of allegiances, a new set of risks, and new opportunities for those astute enough to navigate the treacherous political waters. Diocletian learned from each of these experiences, observing the mistakes of those who preceded him, understanding the precarious nature of imperial power, and perhaps most importantly, recognizing the deep-seated problems plaguing the empire. He saw firsthand how instability at the top trickled down, causing economic collapse, widespread fear, and constant civil strife. By the time he reached his mid-30s, Diocletian had attained the prestigious position of commander of the protectors. Domestici, the imperial bodyguard. This was a critical role, placing him in close proximity to the emperor and within the inner circle of power. It allowed him to observe the machinations of the court, the jealousies, the betrayals, and the constant threat of assassination. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a political player, albeit a quiet and observant one. His moment arrived in 284 AD, under rather dramatic circumstances. The reigning Emperor Numerian died under mysterious circumstances while returning from a campaign in Persia. His Praetorian prefect Aper was widely suspected of poisoning him. The army, needing a new leader, convened to choose Numenorean's successor. It was a tense moment. Amidst the legions, a general was needed, someone strong, capable, and trustworthy. Stepped forward. According to historical accounts, he publicly swore an oath of innocence regarding Numerian's death. Then, in a striking display of conviction and perhaps a bit of calculated theatre, he personally executed Aper on the spot, plunging his sword into him before the assembled troops. This decisive act served multiple purposes. It cleared his own name, eliminated a potential rival, and demonstrated an unyielding resolve and commitment to justice, or at least to asserting his authority. It was a brutal but effective move that solidified his claim to power in the eyes of the legions. By the time he reached his mid-30s, Diocletian had attained the prestigious position of commander of the Protectors Domestici, the imperial bodyguard. This was a critical role, placing him in close proximity to the emperor and within the inner circle of power. It allowed him to observe the machinations of the court, the jealousies, the betrayals, and the constant threat of assassination. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a political player, albeit a quiet and observant one. His moment arrived. In 284 AD, under rather dramatic circumstances, the reigning Emperor Numerian died under mysterious circumstances while returning from a campaign in Persia. His Praetorian prefect, Aper, was widely suspected of poisoning him. The army, needing a new leader, convened to choose Numenorean's successor. It was a tense moment. Amidst the legions, a general was needed, someone strong, capable, and trustworthy. Diocletian stepped forward. According to historical accounts, he publicly swore an oath of innocence regarding Numerian's death. Then, in a striking display of conviction and perhaps a bit of calculated theatre, he personally executed Aper on the spot, plunging his sword into him before the assembled troops. This decisive act served multiple purposes. It cleared his own name, eliminated a potential rival, and demonstrated an unyielding resolve and commitment to justice, or at least to asserting his authority. It was a brutal but effective move that solidified his claim to power in the eyes of the legions. Imagine the scene: the dusty military camp, the assembled soldiers, the tension in the air as they awaited the next move. And then, this decisive, almost primal act of justice. It wasn't about refined politics. It was about raw power and immediate accountability, a language the soldiers understood perfectly. This act, more than any long speech or political maneuvering, marked his true ascension. He wasn't just another general. He was the general, a man of action who would bring order to chaos. This moment underscores a fundamental aspect of Roman imperial power at the time. It often rested on the loyalty of the army. To become emperor, you needed the legions to declare you so, and to remain emperor, you needed to keep them on your side. Diocletian, having risen through these very ranks, understood this implicitly. He was a soldier's emperor, and this connection would prove invaluable in his efforts to stabilize the empire. His humble beginnings, his years of military service, and his keen observations of the tumultuous 3rd century had prepared him, perhaps uniquely, for the monumental task that lay ahead, not just to rule, but to rebuild Rome from its foundations. Section 3. With Aper's dramatic demise and the acclamation of the legions, Diocletian's ascension to power was complete. But this wasn't a triumphant entry into a stable, flourishing empire. Far from it. He inherited a colossal mess, a sprawling, fractured entity teetering on the brink of disintegration. The Roman Empire in 284 AD was a shadow of its former self, weakened by decades of internal strife, economic collapse, and relentless external pressures. This period, as we briefly touched upon, is historically known as the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was a truly harrowing time to be a Roman, let alone its emperor. Imagine the sheer weight of it all. The empire was simply too vast for one man to govern effectively, especially with communication and travel being so slow. Rebellions flared up constantly in distant provinces. Barbarian tribes, emboldened by Rome's internal divisions, launched devastating raids across the borders: Goths in the east, Alemanni in the north, Franks along the Rhine. The economy was in shambles, crippled by inflation, debased coinage, and disrupted trade routes. Soldiers often went unpaid, leading to mutinies and a further erosion of loyalty. And politically, the concept of a stable succession had completely broken down. With over 20 legitimate emperors and countless usurpers claiming the throne in a mere 50-year span before each succession was often marked by violence and civil war, further draining the empire's already stretched resources. Diocletian understood immediately that the traditional model of imperial rule, with a single emperor attempting to manage everything from Rome, was no longer viable. The empire was too large, its problems too numerous, and the threats too diverse. A radical solution was needed, something unprecedented in Roman history. He needed to decentralize power, not to weaken it, but to strengthen it by making it more responsive and efficient. This realization would lead him to implement his most famous and enduring administrative innovation, the Tetrarchy. But before the Tetrarchy, Diocletian had to secure his position. He was not the only claimant to power. Carinus, Numerian's brother, was also emperor, ruling in the west. A confrontation was inevitable. In the spring of 285 AD, Diocletian marched west and met Carinus's forces at the Battle of the Margus in modern-day Serbia. The battle was fierce, and by some accounts, Carinus's army initially held the upper hand. However, a crucial turning point came when Carinus was assassinated by his own officers, perhaps due to personal grievances or a calculated betrayal designed to curry favor with Diocletian. With Carinus dead, his army defected, and Diocletian became the undisputed emperor of the entire Roman world. This victory was crucial, but it only underscored the immense task ahead. He had won the throne, but now he had to save the empire, and he began almost immediately to lay the groundwork for his revolutionary system. He recognized that the old capital, Rome, while symbolically important, was no longer geographically central to the empire's defense needs. The most pressing threats were on the frontiers, along the Danube, the Rhine, and in the east, against Persia. So, Diocletian began to rule not from Rome, but from Nicomedia in modern-day Turkey, a city much closer to the eastern frontier, where the Persian threat was constant. This move, while practical, subtly shifted the traditional center of power away from the Eternal City, a hint of the radical changes to come. He also began to reorganize the military, strengthening the border defenses and creating mobile field armies that could quickly respond to incursions. His pragmatic approach extended to his personal style as well. While he embraced some of the elaborate ceremonial aspects of Persian monarchy, perhaps to elevate the emperor's status above the squabbles of ambitious generals, his core focus remained on effective governance. He understood that respect, rather than mere popularity, was essential for long-term stability. The journey from a humble provincial background to the undisputed master of the Roman world was extraordinary. It spoke volumes about his character, his determination, his strategic mind, and his willingness to make difficult, sometimes brutal, decisions. But all this was merely preparation for the truly monumental task ahead: the systematic restructuring of the entire Roman state. The chaotic years of the crisis of the 3rd century had demonstrated that a single, overstretched emperor was a recipe for disaster. Diocletian's immediate task was to stabilize the political landscape, but his long-term vision was to fundamentally alter the very architecture of Roman governance, ushering in an era of unprecedented, albeit strict, order. And it's this very order, this meticulous attention to detail, that perhaps led him down the path to his later, surprisingly simple, horticultural pursuits. Section 4. Diocletian, having surveyed the sprawling, chaotic empire he now commanded, came to a profound and revolutionary conclusion. It was simply too much for one man. The sheer scale of governance, the constant military threats on multiple frontiers, and the ever-present danger of internal rebellion demanded a radical new approach. His solution, audacious in its simplicity, yet complex in its implementation, was the Tetrarchy, or rule by 4. This wasn't merely a division of labor. It was a complete restructuring of imperial authority, designed to bring stability and efficiency to a system on the verge of collapse. He didn't jump straight to 4 emperors. His first move was more cautious, a test of the concept. In 285 AD, a year after becoming sole emperor, he appointed his trusted friend and fellow military commander, Maximian, as his Caesar, effectively a junior emperor. Maximian was given responsibility for the western half of the empire, dealing with problems in Gaul, Britain, and Africa, while Diocletian retained control of the wealthier and more strategically vital East, which included Egypt, Syria, and the crucial Persian frontier. This initial partnership worked well. Maximian proved himself a capable military leader, suppressing revolts and securing borders in his assigned territories. The success of this two-person rule, known as the Tetrarchy, emboldened Diocletian to expand the system. He saw that even with 2 emperors, the sheer workload and the vast distances still posed significant challenges. So, in 293 AD, he formalized and expanded the system into the full Tetrarchy. He elevated Maximian to the rank of Augustus, making him co-emperor with equal authority. Then, each Augustus appointed his own Caesar. Diocletian chose Galerius, a tough and experienced soldier, to be his Caesar in the east. Maximian, in turn, appointed Constantius Chlorus, the father of the future Constantine the Great, as his Caesar in the west. Now, the empire was officially governed by 4 men, 2 Augusti, the senior emperors, and 2 Caesars, the junior emperors. The idea was brilliant in its conception. Each emperor had a distinct geographical area of responsibility, allowing for swifter responses to local crises, whether military incursions or administrative issues. The empire was effectively divided into 4 prefectures, each with its own capital city that was strategically located closer to a frontier than Rome. Diocletian ruled from Nicomedia, Galerius from Sirmium, modern-day Sremska Mitrovica in Serbia, Maximian from Mediolanum, modern-day Milan, and Constantius from Augusta, Treverorum, modern-day Trier in Germany. Noticeably absent from this list of capitals was Rome itself, a clear signal that the symbolic heart of the empire was no longer its administrative or military center. The Tetrarchy also had a built-in succession plan, which was one of its most revolutionary aspects. The Caesars were not just military commanders, they were designated heirs. The plan was that after a set period, Diocletian envisioned 20 years, the Augusti would voluntarily retire, and the Caesars would automatically step up to become the new Augusti, in turn appointing their own Caesars. This was meant to break the cycle of violent successions and civil wars that had plagued Rome for decades. Imagine the shift in mindset. Instead of fighting for the throne, you simply waited for your turn. It was a bold attempt to create a peaceful, orderly transfer of power, something unprecedented in Roman history. To further bind the tetrarchs together and ensure loyalty, Diocletian established family ties. Galerius married Diocletian's daughter, Valeria, and Constantius married Maximian's stepdaughter, Theodora. These marriages were not just personal unions, they were political alliances, designed to create a sense of shared purpose and familial connection among the rulers. Under the Tetrarchy, each emperor was responsible for defending his assigned frontiers, administering justice, and overseeing the collection of taxes in his region. This distributed workload brought a new level of efficiency to imperial governance. Decisions could be made more quickly, troops could be deployed faster, and local problems could be addressed without waiting for directives from a distant single emperor. For instance, while Diocletian was battling Persians in the east, Maximian could be suppressing a rebellion in North Africa, and Constantius could be pushing back barbarian raids along the Rhine. This system, though seemingly complex, brought an astonishing degree of stability to the Roman Empire after decades of chaos. It allowed Diocletian to implement a series of wide-ranging reforms across the empire, from economic policies to military reorganization, which we'll touch upon shortly. The sheer administrative genius of the Tetrarchy lay in its recognition of the empire's overwhelming size and the necessity of shared, decentralized authority. It bought Rome valuable time, extending its lifespan and allowing it to regroup and recover from the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a testament to Diocletian's clear-headed assessment of the empire's woes and his willingness to break, with centuries of tradition to solve them. This period of stability, ironically, would also lay the groundwork for his eventual and perhaps surprising decision to step away from it all and cultivate his garden. With the Tetrarchy firmly established, Diocletian was not content to merely manage the empire. He embarked on an ambitious and comprehensive program of reforms designed to tackle every aspect of Roman life, from the military to the economy, and from law to administration. His goal was nothing less than to restore stability, prosperity, and the glory of Rome. These reforms, often sweeping and sometimes harsh, fundamentally reshaped the empire and left a lasting legacy. One of his most critical areas of focus was the military. The crisis of the 3rd century had exposed severe weaknesses in Rome's defenses. Diocletian understood that a strong, well-organized army was the bedrock of imperial power. He dramatically increased the size of the army, expanding it to an unprecedented 500,000 men. To manage this larger force, he divided the legions into smaller, more manageable units. He also created 2 distinct types of armies, the limitanae or border guards, who were stationed along the frontiers to repel initial incursions, and the comitatenses, highly mobile field armies that could be rapidly deployed to trouble spots. Anywhere within the empire, this dual system allowed for both constant vigilance and swift, concentrated response, vastly improving Rome's defensive capabilities. Imagine the immense logistical challenge of feeding, equipping, and paying such a vast military machine, but Diocletian was nothing if not a meticulous organizer. Next came administrative reforms. He believed the existing provincial structure was inefficient and prone to rebellion. He dramatically increased the number of provinces, effectively subdividing the larger ones into smaller, more manageable units. This meant fewer resources and less power for any single provincial governor, reducing their ability to challenge imperial authority. These new, smaller provinces were then grouped into larger administrative units called dioceses, each overseen by a vicarius. These dioceses, in turn, were grouped into the 4 praetorian prefectures of the Tetrarchy. This hierarchical structure created a more centralized and efficient bureaucracy, extending imperial control down to the local level with unprecedented precision. Every layer of administration reported to the layer above it, ensuring a flow of information and directives up and down the chain of command. Perhaps the most challenging and controversial of his reforms were economic. The Roman economy was in tatters, ravaged by hyperinflation caused by decades of debased coinage. Successive emperors had reduced the silver content in coins to pay for their armies and lavish spending, leading to a loss of public trust in the currency and soaring prices. Diocletian attempted to restore faith in the currency by minting new, higher quality gold and silver coins. However, this alone wasn't enough to curb inflation. In 301 AD, he issued his infamous edict on maximum prices, a decree that fixed maximum prices for thousands of goods and services, from agricultural products to wages for artisans. The edict was an attempt to control inflation by law, but it proved largely unenforceable. Merchants often hoarded goods rather than selling them at a loss, leading to shortages and a thriving black market. The penalties for violating the edict were severe, sometimes even death, yet it ultimately failed to achieve its goals and was largely ignored within a few years. It was a classic example of well-intentioned but economically misguided intervention. He also reformed the taxation system. Recognizing that the old, haphazard methods were insufficient, he introduced a more rigorous and standardized system. Taxes were now collected in both coin and in-kind goods like grain or oil, often based on a regular census of land and population. This ensured a more predictable and consistent flow of revenue to the imperial treasury, essential for funding the expanded army and bureaucracy. While this brought much-needed fiscal stability, it also placed a heavy burden on the populace, leading to resentment, particularly among farmers. Beyond the military and economy, Diocletian also reformed the legal system, establishing clearer legal codes and procedures, and building magnificent new public works and fortifications across the empire. His reign saw a burst of construction, from palaces and bathhouses to new frontier defenses and roads, all designed to project imperial power and improve infrastructure. These reforms, collectively, were monumental. They were born out of a desperate need to rescue the Roman Empire from its nadir. Diocletian's era marked a definitive shift from the classical Roman Empire to what historians sometimes call the Dominates, a more authoritarian and centralized form of governance where the emperor was more explicitly a dominus or lord, rather than merely a princeps or first citizen. The power of the Senate was further diminished, and the emperor's authority became absolute, almost sacred. While these reforms brought much-needed stability and extended the lifespan of the Roman Empire for another century and a half in the West, and 1,000 years in the East, they also came at a cost. The increased bureaucracy, heavy taxation, and strict controls often stifled individual initiative and created a more rigid society. Yet, in the context of the preceding chaos, many Romans likely welcomed the order and security that Diocletian's iron fist provided. It was a trade-off, stability for freedom, and at the time, stability was arguably the more pressing need. This period of intense reform also saw the beginning of another, far less pleasant, aspect of his reign, which we will turn to next. A period of intense religious persecution that stands in stark contrast to his otherwise pragmatic approach to governance. While Diocletian's reforms brought unprecedented stability and order to the Roman Empire, there's a darker, far more tragic chapter to his reign that stands in stark contrast to his pragmatic statesmanship: the Great Persecution. This period, beginning in 303 AD, was the Roman Empire's last, largest, and most brutal official persecution of Christians, resulting in widespread suffering, imprisonment, torture, and executions across the empire. To understand why a pragmatic and seemingly rational ruler like Diocletian would embark on such a campaign, we need to consider the broader context of Roman belief and the role of religion in the state. Traditional Roman religion was polytheistic and deeply interwoven with civic identity. The welfare of the state was believed to depend on the correct observance of rituals and sacrifices to the traditional Roman gods. To refuse to participate in these rites was seen not just as a religious deviation, but as an act of impiety towards the gods and disloyalty to the emperor and the state. Christians, with their monotheistic belief and refusal to worship the Roman gods or participate in imperial cults, which involved venerating the emperor as divine, were viewed with deep suspicion. They were often seen as secretive, exclusive, and even subversive, blamed for everything from natural disasters to military defeats because their refusal to honor the traditional gods was thought to incur divine wrath. For decades, Christians had faced intermittent, localized persecutions, but never before had there been a systematic, empire-wide effort to eradicate the faith. Diocletian, a traditionalist himself, likely saw Christianity as a threat to the unity and stability he was so desperately trying to forge. He believed that the old Roman ways, including the worship of the traditional gods, were essential to the empire's strength and prosperity. The growing number of Christians and their steadfast refusal to conform might have seemed like an insidious cancer undermining the very foundations he was attempting to rebuild. The initial impetus for the Great Persecution often comes from Diocletian's Caesar in the East, Galerius. Galerius was a staunch traditionalist and reputedly a fierce opponent of Christianity. It is believed that he heavily influenced Diocletian, who was initially more hesitant to initiate the persecution. In the winter of 300 to 303 AD, after consulting with oracles and senior officials, Diocletian issued a series of edicts that escalated the persecution step by step. The first edict, issued on February 24, 303 AD, targeted Christian clergy and property. It ordered the destruction of Christian churches and sacred texts, and forbade Christians from assembling for worship. It also stripped Christians of their legal rights and status, making them vulnerable to arbitrary arrest and torture. Imagine the fear and despair that must have swept through Christian communities as their places of worship were razed and their sacred scrolls burned. a second edict followed, ordering the arrest and imprisonment of all Christian clergy. The prisons quickly became overflowing. A third edict offered freedom to those imprisoned clergy who would agree to sacrifice to the Roman gods, but ordered continued torture for those who refused. This was a clear attempt to break the leadership of the Christian community. The fourth and most severe edict, issued in 304 AD, extended the order to all citizens of the empire. Everyone was commanded to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods, and those who refused faced immediate execution, often by gruesome means. This was an attempt to force universal compliance and stamp out Christianity entirely. Across the empire, altars were set up in public squares, and citizens were compelled to offer incense or sacrifice, receiving a certificate as proof of their compliance. Those who refused faced summary execution, often by beheading, burning, or being thrown to wild beasts in the arena. The severity and impact of the persecution varied across the empire. In the West, particularly in the territories ruled by Constantius Chlorus, father of Constantine, the persecution was less zealous and often limited to the destruction of churches. Constantius, perhaps more sympathetic to Christians or simply more pragmatic, tended to enforce the edicts half-heartedly. However, in the East, under Diocletian and especially Galerius, the persecution was relentless and brutal. Martyrs were made, their stories later becoming foundational narratives for the nascent Christian church. Many Christians went into hiding, others bravely faced their deaths, and some, under duress, apostatized, only to seek reconciliation with the church later. This systematic effort to destroy Christianity ultimately failed. Despite the immense suffering, the Christian community proved remarkably resilient. The unwavering faith of many martyrs actually served to inspire others and strengthen the resolve of the community. Within a few years of Diocletian's abdication, the persecution would largely cease, and under Constantine the Great, Christianity would eventually become the favored religion of the empire. The great persecution remains a stain on Diocletian's otherwise often praised reign. It shows the limits of his pragmatism, revealing a deep-seated conservatism and a willingness to use extreme measures when he perceived a threat to the traditional order he so desperately sought to restore. This era of immense pressure and upheaval also coincides with the lead-up to perhaps the most shocking decision of his imperial career, one that would cement his legacy as an emperor unlike any other: his unprecedented decision to voluntarily abdicate the throne, a decision that would, perhaps, free him to pursue his quieter, more letter-centric passions after nearly 2 decades of absolute power. Having transformed the Roman Empire from a chaotic mess into a remarkably stable and efficiently run state, Diocletian did something utterly unprecedented in Roman history. He voluntarily abdicated. On May 1st, 305 AD, in a solemn ceremony held near his palace in Nicomedia, he formally laid down his imperial robes and relinquished his authority. On the very same day, his co-Augustus, Maximian, reluctantly followed suit in Mediolanum, pressured by Diocletian to adhere to the plan. This act was nothing short of revolutionary. Throughout Roman history, emperors had died in office, often violently, or had been overthrown. The idea of an emperor, particularly one as powerful and successful as Diocletian, simply walking away from the ultimate position of authority was almost unthinkable. It flew in the face of every ambition, every thirst for power that had driven so many before him to claim the throne and cling to it until their last breath. So, why did he do it? The most immediate reason was to put the Tetrarchy succession plan into action. Diocletian had designed the system not just for shared governance, but also for peaceful transitions of power. He had always envisioned a 20-year reign for the Augusti, after which they would step down and allow the Caesars to ascend. By setting this example, he aimed to solidify the principle of orderly succession, demonstrating that the system worked and that power could be relinquished without bloodshed. He genuinely believed that this was the only way to prevent a return to the destructive civil wars of the past. He wanted to prove that the Roman Empire could function without a single, indispensable individual at its helm. Beyond the formal mechanism of the Tetrarchy, there were likely other, more personal motivations. Diocletian had been emperor for 20 years, a long and arduous reign marked by relentless work, military campaigns, and administrative reforms. He was tired, perhaps even exhausted. The burdens of governing such a vast empire, constantly battling external threats and internal dissent, must have taken a significant toll. He had also recently suffered from a severe illness in 304 AD, which left him frail and perhaps even prompted him to consider his mortality and the desirability of a peaceful retirement. The illness was so debilitating that there were rumors he had died or gone insane, and it certainly seems to have solidified his resolve to step down. Imagine the sheer mental and physical strain. Every decision, every military campaign, every financial reform, every legal decree rested on his shoulders. The responsibility was immense, and the pressure unceasing. Even a man of Diocletian's formidable constitution would eventually feel the weight of such a burden. The idea of a quiet retirement, away from the constant pressures of court and campaign, must have seemed incredibly appealing. His choice of retirement location was deliberate and telling: Salona, on the Adriatic coast, in his native Dalmatia. Here, he had spent years overseeing the construction of an enormous, fortified palace complex, designed not just as a luxurious retreat, but also as a secure, self-sufficient residence. It was a clear indication that he had planned this retirement meticulously, not as an impulsive whim, but as the culmination of his life's work. He wasn't just giving up power, his choice of retirement location was deliberate and telling: Salona, on the Adriatic coast, in his native Dalmatia. Here, he had spent years overseeing the construction of an enormous fortified palace complex, designed not just as a luxurious retreat, but also as a secure, self-sufficient residence. It was a clear indication that he had planned this retirement meticulously, not as an impulsive whim, but as the culmination of his life's work. He wasn't just giving up power, he was actively creating a new life for himself, one focused on personal peace rather than political dominance. The abdication ceremony itself was a powerful moment. Before his legions and officials, Diocletian formally announced his decision, proclaimed Galerius and Constantius as the new Augusti, and oversaw the appointment of two new Caesars, Maximinus Dia and Severus. He had meticulously orchestrated the transition, ensuring that everything proceeded according to his grand design. While Maximian initially resisted, clinging to power, Diocletian eventually convinced, or perhaps coerced him to follow suit, reinforcing the idea that this was a collective, institutional decision, not merely a personal one. This act of voluntary abdication left a profound impression on subsequent generations, even if the Tetrarchy itself didn't last long after his departure. It demonstrated an extraordinary level of discipline, self-restraint, and commitment to a larger political ideal. For a man who had risen from humble origins to absolute power, It was a remarkable display of detachment from the very thing most men craved. He had secured the empire, implemented his reforms, and now he was stepping aside to allow his carefully constructed system to continue. His retirement was not merely symbolic, it was real. He did not interfere in imperial politics after his abdication, even when the Tetrarchy began to unravel. When Maximian later tried to persuade him to return to power, Diocletian famously rebuffed him with words that hint at his newfound contentment. This deliberate retreat from public life underscored his commitment to his plan and his personal desire for peace. It was in this quiet retirement, within the walls of his magnificent palace, that Diocletian truly embraced a life far removed from the clamor of the court and the battlefield. A life that would become, for him, surprisingly centered around the simple, rhythmic pleasures of the garden. After the unprecedented act of abdication, Diocletian retreated to his magnificent palace in Salona, on the sun-drenched Adriatic coast of Dalmatia, the very region of his humble birth. This wasn't just a grand country estate. It was a sprawling, self-contained, fortified complex, more akin to a small city, reflecting both his imperial status and his need for security even in retirement. Imagine the crisp sea air, the scent of pine, and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, a stark contrast to the dust and clamor of military camps or the intricate, often suffocating, politics of Nicomedia, Diocletian's palace. As it is known today, the remains of which form the heart of modern-day Split, Croatia, was not built on a whim. Its construction began years before his abdication, demonstrating his long-term planning and unwavering intention to retire. This monumental undertaking involved thousands of laborers, skilled craftsmen, and vast resources, creating a truly impressive architectural marvel. It blended elements of a Roman castrum military camp with a luxurious villa, featuring massive defensive walls, watchtowers, and gates, alongside temples, baths, residential quarters, and expansive gardens. It was designed to be both a comfortable residence and an impregnable fortress, a testament to his continued awareness of the volatile world he had left behind, yet chose to inhabit on his own terms. Within these impressive walls, Diocletian embarked on a life far removed from the imperial purple. He shed the immense burden of governing an empire and embraced a quieter, more reflective existence. His days were no longer consumed by military strategy, economic policy, or the intricate dance of court politics. Instead, he found solace in the simple, fundamental rhythms of nature and the tangible rewards of manual labor. This was a man who, just months before, had held the ultimate power in the known world. He had commanded legions, dictated laws, and influenced the lives of millions. Now, he chose to spend his time walking through his vast gardens, overseeing their cultivation, and, most famously, tending to his vegetable patches. This wasn't just a leisurely pastime. It was an active engagement with the earth, a pursuit that offered a different kind of fulfillment than the triumphs of war or the successes of governance. Consider the stark, psychological shift required for such a transition. Most men who achieve such heights of power become addicted to it, unable to conceive of a life without the constant adulation, the endless decision-making, the thrill of command. Yet Diocletian willingly exchanged the imperial scepter for the gardening hoe. It speaks volumes about his character. A pragmatist to the core, he recognized when his work was done, and he had the discipline to walk away. His retirement wasn't entirely secluded. He would have been attended by a retinue of household staff, guards, and perhaps a few close companions. But the oppressive formality of court life, the constant demands for an audience, the the ceaseless flow of petitions and reports. All of that was gone. He was no longer the public face of the empire, but a private citizen, albeit one of immense wealth and historical significance, enjoying the fruits of his labor, both literally and figuratively. It's tempting to romanticize this retirement, imagining long, peaceful days spent in quiet contemplation amidst fragrant blossoms. And while there certainly would have been elements of that tranquility, it was also a reflection of a deeply practical mind. His garden wasn't just for beauty, it was for sustenance. And among the various plants he cultivated, one humble vegetable held a particularly special place in his daily life. A preference that would become almost legendary. Lettuce. This deep engagement with gardening offered a tangible sense of accomplishment, a direct connection to the earth and the cycle of growth that was perhaps a welcome antidote to the abstract, often frustrating, challenges of imperial rule. Instead of wrestling with barbarians or bankrupt treasuries, he was now wrestling with weeds and ensuring the health of his crops. The results were immediate and visible: a flourishing garden, fresh produce, a sense of quiet satisfaction. This connection to the land, this embrace of a simpler, more grounded existence, was the defining feature of his twilight years. It provided a powerful counter-narrative to the relentless pursuit of power, suggesting that true contentment could be found not in dominion, but in the quiet dignity of cultivation. It was here, in the fertile soil of his retirement palace, that his peculiar dietary habit would truly flourish, becoming the defining, if somewhat understated, characteristic of his post-imperial life. It is here, within the serene, sun-drenched walls of his massive palace in Salona, that the truly fascinating aspect of Diocletian's retirement comes into sharp focus. His particular, almost exclusive, obsession with lettuce. This wasn't just a casual preference. It appears to have been the cornerstone of his diet, a foodstuff he consumed with remarkable frequency and dedication for years. How did this most unassuming of vegetables come to dominate the palate of a man who once commanded the world's most powerful empire? The specific origins of his lettuce obsession are, understandably, not detailed in great historical texts that typically focus on battles and imperial decrees. However, we can infer some compelling reasons and paint a vivid picture of how this peculiar habit likely developed and sustained itself. Firstly, recall Diocletian's pragmatic nature. He was a man who prized efficiency, self-sufficiency, and control. In his retirement, growing his own food offered a tangible sense of control over his immediate environment, a stark contrast to the vast, unwieldy empire he had just relinquished. Lettuce is notoriously easy to grow, requires relatively little space, and provides a quick yield. It can be cultivated almost year-round in the Mediterranean climate of Dalmatia, ensuring a continuous supply of fresh greens. For a man who understood logistics and supply chains on an imperial scale, mastering his own personal food supply would have been deeply satisfying. Secondly, there's the element of simplicity and self-sufficiency. After 2 decades of opulent imperial feasts, elaborate banquets, and endless culinary choices, the simplicity of a diet centered around lettuce might have been a deliberate choice. It represented a shedding of the excesses of power, a return to a more fundamental, almost monastic way of eating. It was humble, uncomplicated, and perhaps deeply grounding. Imagine the contrast, from tables laden with exotic meats, wines, and delicacies from across the empire, to the crisp, fresh taste of a simple lettuce leaf, plucked directly from his own garden. This was a culinary rebellion against imperial pomp, a quiet assertion of personal autonomy. Thirdly, and perhaps most intriguingly, consider the health aspect. While ancient Roman understanding of nutrition was not scientific in the modern sense, they certainly had observations about the properties of different foods. Lettuce, even then, was known for its cooling properties, its mild taste, and its perceived digestive benefits. It was considered a light, easily digestible food. After a life of stress, military campaigns, and undoubtedly a rich imperial diet that could lead to various ailments, a simple, cleansing diet of lettuce might have been prescribed by his physicians, or perhaps discovered by Diocletian himself, to promote well-being and aid digestion. It was a common belief in the ancient world that certain foods had specific effects on the body's humors, and lettuce was often associated with calmness and even promoting sleep, a rather fitting choice for our boring history for sleep narrative. Furthermore, Diocletian's active engagement in gardening meant he was intimately familiar with every stage of lettuce cultivation. He would have known the best varieties, the ideal conditions for growth, and how to harvest it at its peak freshness. The act of nurturing something from seed to edible plant could have provided a profound sense of accomplishment, a direct and immediate reward that the abstract, often long-term, results of imperial policy could not match. He was literally eating the fruits of his labor, his famous rebuff to Maximian, who urged him to return to imperial life, perfectly encapsulates this newfound contentment. If you could see the cabbages I have planted with my own hands at Salona, you would never suggest that I replace the happiness of this place with the storms of a never-ending greed. While he mentions cabbages, historians generally interpret this as a broader reference to his vegetable garden, with lettuce likely being a prominent, if not the primary, crop. The quote beautifully illustrates his preference for the tangible, peaceful satisfaction of gardening over the abstract, turbulent anxieties of imperial power. The calm satisfaction of a perfectly tended bed of greens far outweighed the storms of never-ending greed that characterized the political arena. The image of the mighty Diocletian, the architect of the Tetrarchy and restorer of Roman order, meticulously tending to his lettuce patch, is a powerful one. It humanizes him, showing a side far removed from the stern, unyielding emperor. It suggests a man who, having achieved everything the world could offer in terms of power and glory, discovered true contentment in the most unexpected and humble of pursuits. His lettuce obsession wasn't just a quirky habit, it was a symbol of his deliberate choice for a simpler, more grounded existence, a testament to his unique philosophy of life after power. It's a quiet, green echo of his remarkable journey from obscurity to dominance, and then to a peculiar, verdant peace. Diocletian's newfound passion for gardening wasn't just about growing lettuce. It was about the profound connection to the earth, the act of cultivation, and the meticulous care required to bring plants to fruition. His engagement with his garden at Salona elevated gardening from a mere hobby to a central pillar of his post-imperial existence. Imagine him, not in a flowing imperial toga, but perhaps in simpler attire, with soil under his fingernails, overseeing the intricate processes of planting, watering, and harvesting. Gardening, for Diocletian, was likely a deeply satisfying antidote to the abstract and often frustrating world of politics. In the garden, the results of one's labor are tangible and immediate. You plant a seed, you nurture it, and you see it grow. There's a clear cause and effect that must have been immensely gratifying after years of battling complex, intractable, imperial problems where outcomes were often uncertain and dependent on countless variables beyond one's control. A successful harvest of crisp, green lettuce offered a direct, undeniable reward for his efforts. A stark contrast to the often long-delayed or politically compromised results of governing. His palace grounds at Salona would have been designed to incorporate extensive gardens, both ornamental and utilitarian. Roman villas often featured intricate garden layouts, complete with fountains, statues, shaded walkways, and carefully cultivated flower beds. But for Diocletian, the practical, food-producing areas would have held a special significance. He wasn't just admiring the aesthetics. He was actively involved in the process. Think about the sheer scale of his palace. Even a single section of the grounds would have offered ample space for extensive vegetable patches, herb gardens, and perhaps even small orchards. He would have employed skilled gardeners, of course, to manage the larger operations, but it's highly probable, given the accounts, that he personally engaged in the more intimate tasks of cultivation. Perhaps he would choose the specific varieties of lettuce to be planted, or meticulously inspect the health of the leaves, or even participate in the harvest himself. This hands-on involvement would have provided a sense of purpose and connection that imperial life, for all its grandeur, might have lacked. The act of gardening also offers a unique form of mindfulness. It requires patience, observation, and a deep understanding of natural cycles. You cannot rush a plant's growth, nor can you command it to yield prematurely. You must work with nature, adapting to its rhythms. This meditative quality, the slow, repetitive tasks of tending to plants, could have provided a much-needed mental respite after decades of constant decision-making and high-stakes pressures. It was a world where the most pressing concerns might have been a stubborn weed or an unexpected pest, rather than a barbarian invasion or a civil war. Furthermore, his deep connection to the land resonated with traditional Roman values, even if his specific pursuit was unusual for an emperor. Romans generally revered agriculture and saw it as a noble pursuit. Many Roman elites maintained country estates and prided themselves on their farming endeavors. By engaging so wholeheartedly in gardening, Diocletian was perhaps subtly reinforcing these ancient values. Even as he departed from the conventional imperial path, his devotion to his garden also hints at a man who had made peace with his decision. To step down, it wasn't a reluctant retreat, but a deliberate choice, an embrace of a different kind of fulfillment. The success of his garden, the abundance of his lettuce, became a personal triumph, a testament to his continued ability to create order and productivity, albeit on a much smaller, more personal scale. Imagine the quiet pride he must have felt, walking through his flourishing vegetable beds, knowing that the food on his plate had been cultivated by his own design, if not by his own hands entirely. This direct connection to the source of his sustenance, the simple act of eating what he had grown, must have been profoundly satisfying. It was a testament to his self-sufficiency and his liberation from the elaborate, often wasteful, trappings of imperial court life. The simplicity of a meal of fresh, crisp lettuce, harvested moments before it was consumed, offered a purity and honesty that few imperial banquets could ever hope to rival. This passion for cultivation also provided a convenient and entirely sincere justification for his refusal to return to power. His garden wasn't just a physical space, it was a symbol of his newfound freedom and contentment. It was a tangible expression of his commitment to a life beyond the throne, a life that, in his eyes, was far more rewarding than any amount of imperial glory. His garden, therefore, became a powerful statement, a living testament to his unique post-imperial philosophy, centered around the tranquil, restorative power of working with the earth, and of course, his beloved lettuce. While Diocletian's lettuce obsession might sound quirky to our modern ears, it wasn't just a random dietary choice. His preference for lettuce and his overall turn to a simpler, plant-centric diet in retirement aligns with several ancient Roman ideas about health, well-being, and even philosophy. It suggests a thoughtful, perhaps even disciplined, approach to his personal health after decades of rigorous imperial life. Firstly, let's consider the prevailing medical theories of the time. Roman medicine, heavily influenced by Greek thought, operated on the principle of humoral theory, which held that the human body was composed of 4 basic fluids, or humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was maintained by keeping these humors in balance. An illness resulted from an imbalance. Foods were categorized by their inherent qualities, such as hot, cold, wet, or dry, and consumed to restore balance. Lettuce, in particular, was widely considered to be a cooling and moistening food. For someone like Diocletian, who had lived a life of immense stress, constant travel, and undoubtedly a rich, heavy diet during his imperial reign, a cooling food like lettuce might have been seen as beneficial. It was believed to calm the body, aid digestion, and even promote sleep. A perfect fit for our boring history for sleep theme. After years of the storms of never-ending greed in the political world, a diet that promised inner calm and physical balance would have been highly appealing. It's plausible that his physicians, or perhaps his own observations of his body, led him to favor this gentle vegetable. Beyond specific humoral properties, the Romans generally appreciated the digestive benefits of fresh greens. They often started meals with light salads to open the stomach and prepare it for heavier fare, or consumed them at the end of a meal to aid digestion. For Diocletian, a man who valued efficiency and order, a diet that promoted internal harmony and bodily regulation would have been a practical choice. It supported a sense of physical well-being that complemented the mental peace he sought in retirement. Furthermore, there's a philosophical angle. Many ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, particularly those influenced by Stoicism or Epicureanism, advocated for simplicity, moderation, and self-sufficiency. While Diocletian was not known as a philosopher in the traditional sense, his actions in retirement echo these ideals. His embrace of a simple, homegrown diet, rather than relying on the elaborate and costly provisions of the imperial court, was a profound statement of moderation. It was an exercise in self-control and a rejection of excess, aligning him, perhaps inadvertently, with philosophical traditions that valued inner peace over external luxury. His focus on the garden, growing his own food, also resonated with the ancient ideal of the otium, a dignified leisure dedicated to intellectual or agricultural pursuits, often contrasted with negotium, the demanding work of public life. For Roman aristocrats, a well-managed country estate and its productive gardens were a symbol of refined tastes and responsible living. Diocletian, by fully immersing himself in this otium and prioritizing his garden, was embodying a classic Roman ideal of dignified retirement, even if his chosen dietary staple was less common for a former emperor. Consider the practicalities as well. Lettuce is hydrated and refreshing, particularly important in a warm Mediterranean climate. It's a low-calorie, nutrient-rich food that can be consumed in large quantities without feeling heavy. For an older man, perhaps less active than in his military prime, a lighter diet would have been beneficial for maintaining health and energy. The anecdote of his cabbages, interpreted as general garden produce, with lettuce being central to Maximian, is the most famous testament to this. His words were not just about the vegetables themselves, but about the profound contentment they represented. If you could see the cabbages I have planted with my own hands at Salona, you would never suggest that I replace the happiness of this place with the storms of a never-ending greed. This isn't merely a health-conscious choice. It's a declaration of philosophical preference. He had found a superior form of happiness, one rooted in simplicity, nature, and the tangible rewards of personal effort, far removed from the turbulent anxieties and endless ambitions of the imperial throne. His lettuce wasn't just food, it was a symbol of his hard-won peace. Diocletian's peculiar retirement and his apparent devotion to a lettuce-centric diet certainly raised eyebrows among his contemporaries, particularly those still embroiled in the cutthroat world of imperial politics. While direct accounts of specific reactions to his dietary habits are scarce, we can infer a great deal from the broader context of Roman attitudes towards power, leisure, and the unexpected choices of their leaders. For many, Diocletian's abdication itself was astounding. It was an act that defied all norms of Roman imperial ambition. Emperors clung to power, often with a desperate grip, until death or violent overthrow. To simply choose to step away, especially after achieving such monumental successes in stabilizing the empire, would have been seen as utterly bizarre, if not weak, by those who lived and breathed political power. The very notion of relinquishing ultimate authority for the perceived simple pleasures of a garden must have been baffling to many. Imagine the whispered conversations in the imperial courts of the new Augusti, Galerius and Constantius, and their Caesars. Can you believe it? He truly gave it all up. Some might have exclaimed with genuine awe. Others, more cynical, might have questioned his sanity, or perhaps suspected a hidden agenda. Was it a test? Was he secretly pulling strings from afar? The idea that a powerful emperor could simply desire a quiet life of cultivation would have been almost incomprehensible to those whose lives were defined by the endless pursuit and maintenance of power. His successor in the East, Galerius, who had been heavily influenced by Diocletian and arguably was even more authoritarian, might have viewed his predecessor's retirement with a mix of respect and perhaps a touch of exasperation. Galerius himself was a military man, focused on power and control. While he upheld the Tetrarchy for a time, the idea of abandoning it for lettuce would have been far from his own worldview. He did, after all, attempt to persuade Diocletian to return to the throne when the Tetrarchy began to unravel, the famous anecdote of Diocletian's refusal to return to power, referencing his beloved cabbages and by extension, lettuce, offers the most direct insight into his contemporaries' reactions. When Maximian, who had himself been forced into retirement and later attempted a comeback, urged Diocletian to rejoin him and restore the old order amidst the new chaos, Diocletian's response was pointed. If you could see the cabbages I have planted with my own hands at Salona, you would never suggest that I replace the happiness of this place with the storms of a never-ending greed. This statement, recorded by the historian Lactantius, reveals several things. Firstly, it shows Maximian's perspective. He clearly thought Diocletian's retirement was a waste, a temporary aberration, and that the allure of power would eventually draw him back. He couldn't fathom that a life of gardening could genuinely be preferable to ruling an empire. Secondly, it highlights Diocletian's firm conviction in his choice. He wasn't just politely declining. He was asserting that his current life provided a superior form of happiness, one far removed from the storms and greed that characterized imperial politics. to a Roman elite accustomed to luxurious diets and the display of wealth through elaborate cuisine. A diet largely consisting of a humble vegetable like lettuce might have seemed ascetic, eccentric, or even a bit pitiful, while fresh produce was certainly consumed. A singular focus on one vegetable as a primary food source would have been unusual. It subtly underlined his complete detachment from the traditional markers of imperial status and luxury. However, some, particularly those inclined towards Stoic philosophy or simply exhausted by the empire's perpetual turmoil, might have seen his choice as profoundly wise. For them, Diocletian embodied the ideal of a man who knew when he had done enough, a leader with the strength of character to prioritize personal peace over endless ambition. His actions might have been interpreted as a moral lesson that true contentment isn't found in power or wealth, but in simplicity and self-sufficiency. Ultimately, the general reaction would have been one of bewilderment mixed with a grudging respect. Bewilderment at the sheer audacity of his abdication and his humble retirement, and respect for the man who had, against all odds, brought stability back to Rome. His lettuce, therefore, became more than just a food item. It became a symbol of his unique legacy, a testament to a powerful emperor who found peace not in conquest, but in cultivation. Diocletian's reign, spanning from 284 to 305 AD, left an indelible mark on the Roman Empire, ushering in a new era that fundamentally reshaped its governance, military, and even its very identity. His legacy extends far beyond his peculiar love for lettuce. It encompasses a comprehensive restructuring that, despite its eventual transformations, provided the necessary framework for the empire to endure for centuries more, particularly in the East. His most immediate and arguably most significant legacy was the restoration of stability. Before him, the empire had suffered 50 years of civil war, economic collapse, and relentless external threats. Diocletian, through sheer force of will, administrative genius, and military might, brought an end to this crisis. He created a period of relative peace and security, allowing the empire to breathe and rebuild. This alone secured his place as one of Rome's most impactful, if not always beloved, emperors. The Tetrarchy system, though it eventually faltered after his retirement, was a groundbreaking administrative innovation. It fundamentally changed the concept of imperial rule, proving that the empire could be governed by multiple emperors working in concert. While Constantine the Great would later revert to a single emperor, the principle of multiple imperial centers and divided authority, rather than a single capital in Rome, became a permanent feature of the late Roman Empire. Milan, Trier, and Nicomedia, the Tetrarchic capitals, retained their importance, and the ultimate division of the empire into East and West, formalized later, can be seen as a direct descendant of Diocletian's initial power sharing. He shattered the myth that Rome itself had to be the sole seat of power. His military reforms were also incredibly significant. By increasing the size of the army and reorganizing it into border guards, limitanae, and mobile field armies, he created a more flexible and robust defense system. This military structure continued to be the backbone of Roman defense well into the Byzantine era, proving its effectiveness against a myriad of threats. The empire became more militarized, with a larger standing army, reflecting the constant pressures it faced. Economically, his attempts to stabilize the currency and reform the taxation system, despite the failures of the Edict on Maximum Prices, laid the groundwork for a more predictable and centralized fiscal administration. The capitatio gatio tax system, linking taxes to both individuals and land, provided a more reliable revenue stream for the state, which was crucial for maintaining the vast military and bureaucracy he had established. While these taxes were often burdensome, they were essential for the empire's survival. Diocletian also presided over a massive building program. Across the empire, new fortifications, administrative buildings, public baths, and palaces were constructed. His own palace at Salona stands as a testament to his architectural ambition and foresight. These constructions not only served practical purposes, but also projected an image of renewed imperial power and confidence. The great persecution of Christians, while a moral stain on his legacy, also had an unintended long-term impact. The resilience of the Christian community in the face of such brutality ultimately strengthened the faith. The sheer scale of the persecution solidified Christian identity and resolve, and paradoxically paved the way for its eventual triumph under Constantine. The memory of Diocletian as the last great persecutor inadvertently elevated the status of Christianity as a resilient, powerful force within the empire. In essence, Diocletian created the model for the late Roman Empire, often referred to as that dominate. He transformed the empire from the principate, where the emperor was theoretically the first citizen among equals, to an autocratic system where the emperor was an absolute dominus or lord, with elaborate court rituals and a centralized bureaucracy. This more authoritarian model, while perhaps less Roman in the classical sense, was arguably necessary for the empire's survival in a dramatically changed world. His reforms, though sometimes harsh and rigid, bought the Roman Empire crucial time. They provided a scaffolding that held the vast structure together, preventing its immediate collapse and allowing the eastern half of the empire to evolve into the Byzantine Empire, which would endure for another 1,000 years. Without Diocletian's intervention, the Roman Empire might have fragmented far earlier. His legacy is one of radical pragmatism, a willingness to dismantle and rebuild the state to ensure its survival, even if it meant sacrificing old traditions and embracing new, sometimes unpopular, methods. It's a legacy of an emperor who, having saved the world, then found his truest contentment in the quiet cultivation of a single, humble vegetable. Diocletian's final years spent in peaceful retirement at his magnificent palace in Salona represent the quiet conclusion to an extraordinarily active and impactful life. He lived for several more years after his abdication in 305 AD, witnessing from afar the gradual unraveling of the very system he had meticulously designed to ensure stability. Yet, throughout this period, he steadfastly refused to re-enter the tumultuous world of imperial politics, remaining committed to his chosen path of serene cultivation. His famous refusal to Maximian concerning the cabbages, and, by extension, his beloved lettuce, occurred around 308 AD. At this point, the Tetrarchy, which he had envisioned as a foolproof succession mechanism, was in disarray. The carefully laid plans had begun to unravel almost immediately after his departure. Constantius Chlorus died shortly after becoming Augustus, and his son, Constantine, was immediately proclaimed emperor by his troops, bypassing the established Tetrarchic protocol. This sparked a series of civil wars and usurpations, with multiple claimants to the throne emerging across the empire. It was precisely the kind of chaos Diocletian had worked so hard to prevent. Maximian, his old co-Augustus, who had reluctantly abdicated, saw this instability as an opportunity to return to power. He even tried to persuade Diocletian to join him, perhaps believing that only the original architects of the Tetrarchy could restore order. But Diocletian, true to his word and his newfound contentment, firmly declined. His response, emphasizing the happiness found in his garden over the storms of never-ending greed, was not just a clever quip. It was a genuine reflection of his state of mind. He had made his choice, and he found true peace in it. Imagine the perspective from his quiet gardens. News would undoubtedly reach him of the ongoing conflicts, the betrayals, and the shifting alliances. Messengers would arrive, perhaps bearing pleas or warnings. Yet he chose to remain detached. He had done his part. He had built the structure, and if others chose to dismantle it through their ambition, that was no longer his burden. His focus was on the tangible, the immediate, the flourishing life within his palace walls, the success of a season's crops, the development of his carefully tended plants. These were his new victories. Far removed from the bloody battlefields and treacherous courts, historical accounts suggest that Diocletian continued his active involvement in his gardens, finding profound satisfaction in his horticultural pursuits. He lived out his days, surrounded by the natural beauty he had cultivated, the sounds of the sea, and the rhythm of agricultural life. This was a man who had commanded vast armies, presided over a massive bureaucracy, and orchestrated the lives of millions. Now content with the simple act of tending to a few acres of land, the exact date and circumstances of his death are not definitively known, but it is generally accepted that he died in his palace in Salona in 311 AD, having lived long enough to see Constantine emerge as a dominant force, though not yet the sole emperor. He passed away peacefully, unlike so many emperors before and after him who met violent ends. His death marked the quiet end of an era, a final act of tranquility for a man who had brought so much order to a chaotic world. His life thus came full circle. Born in Dalmatia to humble origins, he returned to that same region to live out his days in a self-imposed, luxurious, yet humble retirement. The man who had worn the imperial purple, dictated laws, and battled barbarians, chose to find his ultimate fulfillment in the green simplicity of his garden, particularly in the cultivation and consumption of lettuce. It's a powerful narrative of ambition fulfilled, power relinquished, and peace found in the most unexpected of places. His story serves as a profound meditation on the nature of leadership, the allure of power, and the surprising paths to human contentment. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in clinging to control, but in the wisdom of knowing when to let go and find joy in the smallest, greenest corners of one's own making. Diocletian's journey from a humble provincial soldier to the most powerful man in the Roman world, and then to a contented retiree tending his lettuce, offers us a rich tapestry of lessons and reflections. What can we, living in our fast-paced, often over-connected world, glean from the life of this ancient emperor? Firstly, his story is a profound meditation on the nature of power. For decades, the Roman Empire had been consumed by an insatiable thirst for power, leading to endless cycles of violence and instability. Emperors clung to their positions with a desperation that often proved fatal. Diocletian, however, showed a different path. He demonstrated that true strength isn't just about accumulating power, but also about the wisdom to know when to relinquish it for the greater good, or indeed for personal well-being. He broke the cycle, at least for a time, proving that peaceful succession was possible. In a world where ambition often leads to self-destruction, Diocletian's voluntary abdication stands as a powerful anomaly, a testament to a unique form of self-mastery. Secondly, his life speaks to the pursuit of stability and order. Diocletian inherited an empire on the verge of collapse. Through sheer organizational genius and unwavering determination, he pulled it back from the brink. His reforms, from the Tetrarchy to the military and economic overhauls, were designed to create structure, predictability, and security. While sometimes heavy-handed, they undeniably brought a desperately needed era of peace. His life reminds us of the human longing for order amidst chaos, and the lengths to which societies will go to achieve it. It also highlights the often involved. Greater security might come at the cost of individual liberties or increased state control. Thirdly, and perhaps most delightfully for our purposes tonight, Diocletian's retirement underscores the profound value of simplicity and personal contentment. After achieving the pinnacle of worldly success, he found his greatest happiness not in further conquest or luxury, but in the quiet, tangible pleasures of gardening. His cabbages, quote, isn't just a quaint historical anecdote, it's a philosophical statement. It argues that the true happiness lies not in the endless pursuit of external validation or material gain, storms of never-ending greed, but in a deeper, more grounded engagement with the simple things in life. For a man who had literally commanded empires, the satisfaction of growing his own food and nurturing life from the soil was a revelation. It reminds us that contentment can often be found in the most unexpected and humble of places, far removed from the clamor and ambition of the world. His story also highlights the enduring human need for connection with nature. In his grand palace, surrounded by the sea and the earth, Diocletian returned to a fundamental human activity, cultivation. There's a calming, almost meditative quality to gardening, a direct interaction with life that can ground even the most powerful individuals. This connection offered him a form of peace that the political arena could never provide. It suggests that even in an age of technological marvels and complex societal structures, the simple rhythms of nature hold an inherent, often overlooked, power to soothe and satisfy. Finally, Diocletian's legacy is a testament to the fragility and resilience of empires. He provided the Roman Empire with a new lease on life, transforming it into a more robust and adaptable entity. Yet, even his meticulously crafted system eventually succumbed to human ambition and external pressures. The Western Roman Empire would eventually fall, but the East, the Byzantine Empire, largely built on the administrative and military foundations laid by Diocletian, would flourish for another 1,000 years. His life is a powerful reminder that even the grandest human endeavors are subject to the tides of history, but also that thoughtful leadership can provide crucial lifelines and reshape destinies. So, as you drift off tonight, perhaps imagine the old Emperor Diocletian walking through his sun-drenched gardens at Salona. Picture him inspecting a crisp head of lettuce, feeling the satisfaction of a good harvest. He had conquered chaos, transformed an empire, and then found his peace in the earth. It's a remarkably calming image, isn't it? A powerful man, shedding the weight of the world for the quiet dignity of a well-tended garden, and the simple, refreshing taste of a green leaf.